and I'll start now, so hopefully people haven't missed too much. Okay, so there are 2 assignments for the module. The first one is due at the end of March and the second one early in June. Those assignments are worth 25% of your final mark each. So, am I lying to you? They're actually, your exam is, give me 1 second. Let me just double check myself because I didn't know this. Make sure I give you the right information. Okay, so the exam is 40%. I do apologize. The exam is 40% of your final mark. 25% for each assignment takes you up to 90%. And the final 10% is across the 4 ICE tasks that you have to complete in each learning unit. So in the learning unit on VC Learn, you'll see for each learning unit, there are a number of activities. And the objective of the activities is to really help you consolidate the content of that particular learning unit. And in each learning unit, one of those activities will have the word ICE in front of it. And that is the one that you have to complete. So you don't have to complete and submit all the activities, but you are required to complete and submit the ICE tasks. There's 1 in each module. They are labeled, so 4 in total, and that makes up the balance of your 10%. And those marks are relatively easy marks. All I really do is check that you've submitted them and give you feedback on them. So you've got your ICE tasks, you've got your 2 assignments, and you've got your final exam. And that's how the marking goes. I hope everybody's clear. ICE tasks, there's no due date for the ICE tasks yet. And what I do, and every tutor is different, is I don't put you under too much pressure to finish your ICE tasks in a module while we're doing that learning unit, but your ICE tasks will all need to have been submitted by the time that your final continuous assessment mark is done, which will be about the end of May. So my suggestion with the ICE tasks is you keep up to date on them, because the last thing you want is towards the end of May, when you've got more assignments due, to be quickly doing those ICE tasks. So as you work through the learning unit, do the ICE task, but there's no set date for them yet. I will give you the date when the continuous assessment marks need to be done at the end of May approximately. So just use them as a pacer for yourself, and it's a good idea to keep up to date on them. So that's how the ICE tasks work. If you've got any questions during this collab, you're welcome to put them into the chat. I will try to get to them as we go along. If there's any questions that are outside this particular learning unit, I can try to address them now. Alternatively, I can do them at the end. And if you still have questions but you don't want to ask them, then please email me your questions. I really don't mind. That is why I am here, is to answer your questions. Okay, so I hope you've all had a chance to watch that introductory video. There is some notes in there about using the APA referencing system, which is the system of referencing we use in psychology. I think in previous educational spaces and places, you might have used the Harvard system. And the APA system is not too different. It's called the American Psychological Association. So it's a specific style of referencing for psychology. And I will put up some resources to help you with that referencing when the time comes. Collab about assignment 1. Yes, we will. We will have what's called a national support session. So before your assignments are due, and it's generally the week before, which would in theory make it next week, is I will run a national support session for all the students where we will go through the assignment. We won't look at the questions in detail, but I'll make sure you get all the technicalities correct and that you have an understanding of what's required. So don't stress about assignments right now, because the first assignment will cover learning unit 1 and 2. So we need to get through that. and I will give you the announcement of the national support session, which I will put on the announcements groups as soon as I find out when I'm running it. But if the assignment is due on the 31st of March, it generally is the week before. What I have done on your calendars is I have added all the collab dates onto your calendars so that you can see the plan of how we'll work. I've also added on the assignment due dates and the tentative dates for the national support sessions. So keep an eye on your calendars. If there's any changes to anything that's on there, I will let you know via an announcement. So your calendar is the place to keep track of everything. Was there something else I was going to say? I think there was, but it's gone from my mind at the moment. Mind is an important concept in psychology, and sometimes mind fails me a little bit, especially in the evenings, but we'll do the best that we can. Right. Are there any other questions right now about anything that's outside the module? I know some of you have had challenges with the learning material and getting onto the platform, but I hope that we're all up and running and you can see everything. Your primary source of reference is going to be your textbook. This is a new textbook this year. It's not the same textbook that we have. We dissect a brain on the screen, but unfortunately we don't do it as a practical assessment. The textbook is a new textbook this year, and so somebody had already bought a secondhand textbook from last year, so please make sure that you've got the right textbook, Psychology, Themes and Variations by Wayne Witten. I'm not sure if that's how you say the surname, but that is the surname. It was introduced because it's a South African edition, so it's got some South African elements to it, which is really nice for the first time to get some South African context in what we learn. So that's the textbook. The material on the VC Learn is really support material for you. So your primary source should be your textbook. When it comes to assignments, there obviously is going to be some research involved, of which you can use your librarian for support if you have any challenges with research, but you'll probably need to go into your library and use one of the databases to research. And I think in my collab session, I did discuss the importance of understanding what academic research is. So to stay clear of referencing websites and things like that are not based on academic research. But I will touch on that in further collab sessions. And your librarian is always there to assist you. One thing when we come to our assignments and our submissions, please no plagiarism. It's your materials and your assignments go through SafeAssign. Any plagiarism is picked up, and there are offenses that I have to log if I see any form of plagiarism. And plagiarism is not just copying word for word from the text, it's also about paraphrasing and learning to paraphrase correctly and learning to paraphrase in a way that your entire submission is not paraphrased. It's important we see your own understanding, your own learning, and your own interpretation of what you read. So please be very aware of plagiarism. Make sure that you cite your references properly in the text and that you have bibliographies. But I will put up resources to help you with that. But please, 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 it's a serious offense to copy anything. The textbook is very different to the old textbook. The themes and stuff are similar, but it is a very different textbook. In terms of the percentages, you check your own percentages. So basically anything over 25% I look at in detail, but I know that it does pick up errors where if you are submitting an assignment and maybe you submit it before the time and you want to resubmit it, it sometimes picks up your first assignment as plagiarism, and it also picks up the bibliographies and references. So it will tell you exactly which elements are deemed as plagiarism, and if it's in the bibliography, I don't have a problem, but if it's in the text of the assignment, there obviously is a problem. So you will see your report, and if you're not 100% sure, you can always ask me. When you submit on SafeAssign, it should give you a percentage. I just see it my side. I'm not entirely sure what you see on your side when you submit it, but it will give you that percentage. So before you submit it, check your percentage and check that anything is out of the ordinary. Kirsten, yeah, these systems can be a little buggy, and I do go through things, and I do understand where there's plagiarism and where there's not. So if in any reason I have a doubt, I could ask you, but you'll know for yourself when you submit what you've plagiarized and what you've paraphrased extensively. Okay, so let's get started. There are 6 learning units in this module. Each one is very different. Psychology is an enormous discipline, and it's a roller coaster of things that we'll learn. We do some history, like we see in the first chapter. We do quite a bit of what looks like biology and life science. We do some things that look like life orientation with study skills and learning. We do some things around development and child development. So it's an enormous discipline. But these learning units are done so in the first year especially. It just exposes you to each of the elements. We don't necessarily go into too much depth. Remember, this is first year of a 3-year degree and maybe even a 4-year degree and further. And as you work through your degree, you'll go more and more into sort of depth and specializations. But this first year module really just exposes you to all these different elements that make up the discipline of psychology. So the very first learning unit that we have here is called the Evolution of Psychology, and I think that makes perfect sense. We're going to touch on how psychology actually evolved as a discipline, and we're going to touch on some of the theorists. We're not going to go into too much depth, and you'll see some of those theorists come up in later modules, and that's where we start to go a little bit more into detail around who they are and what they've added. So most of you should have gone through this first section, and I think there's a great deal of history in it. And I'm not going to touch on too much depth on that kind of stuff, but on the more important stuff. Right, so our breakdown for this learning unit, and you'll see in your module outline, each learning unit has got a breakdown. Okay, and it breaks it down into the different themes. And within each theme, the LO means the learning outcome. That's what you should know when you finish that particular theme. So, for example, the first theme for this learning unit now is what is psychology. So at the end of that section, you need to be able to, and a learning outcome is really what you need to be able to do. So you need to be able to provide a comprehensive definition of psychology and explain the core components. The second theme is on the history. So you need to be able to provide a brief summary of how psychology developed throughout the centuries. And remember, it says they're brief summary, so it doesn't need you to go into great depth and research more about the history unless a specific assignment asks you to do that. It asks you to be able to explain the contributions of the early theorists of the 20th century, as well as discuss how psychology developed in South Africa. And it also asks you to be able to provide an overview of the 6 contemporary theoretical perspectives. So when you get to the end of the learning unit, go back to those outcomes and make sure that you're clear that you are actually able to achieve those learning outcomes. And for each of the learning outcomes, it tells you, in this context, it's chapter 1 of the textbook, but it might ask you specifically to look at some points in the textbook, like the tables that it's got reference there. So that is what happens in this first learning unit. Those are your different themes, and those are your learning outcomes. Okay, I hope that that is clear. So we start right at the beginning of this journey, and we start to understand what the discipline of psychology is. And the discipline of psychology comes from 2 areas, really. It comes from the area of philosophy and philosophical questioning, and it also includes scientific reasoning. So the 2 things together, the philosophical questioning and the scientific reasoning together, make up the discipline of psychology, and you'll see why shortly. So the term psychology comes from 2 Greek words. Its essence is Greek, psyche, meaning the soul, and logos referring to the study of a subject. And the subject in this case, the subject that we're actually studying as psychology, is the mind, the mental processes, and behavior. So you can see automatically that's a very big subject area. So psychology is an ever-evolving discipline. It's been around for a long time. It dates way back in time, which we'll see, and its definition has changed considerably over the years as it has evolved as a discipline in its own right. The important thing to know about psychology, which maybe some of you didn't realize, is that it actually is a science. Psychology, although it falls in the humanitarian subject area, it actually is a science. Everything we study and read about in psychology is rooted in scientific methods of study. And that's really important. When you read research journals, when you read articles, everything that you see in front of you has been tested. It's the result of some kind of study or experiment where conclusions have been drawn, literature has been reviewed, and any point that's made is backed up by scientific reasoning. In our second chapter, we look at some of those ways that we do scientific study around data collection, and data interpretation, but it's really important to remember that. So psychology is a science, and because it follows the empirical method. The scientific status of any endeavor is determined by its method of investigation, not what it studies or when the research was done, and not by who did it. Okay, it's actually the method by which it was done. So it's an empirical science, and that uses objective and precise measurement. This is not necessarily, and more so in more recent times, is it's based on precise sciences. So along with the other humanitarian sciences, things like sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, they're not as precise in their measurements as things like biology, chemistry, or physics, but they use empirical evidence. So therefore, their findings are referred to as scientific. So just remember that, it's very important. So what psychology does, it uses science or systematic methods to identify, analyze, and describe. So those are important things. We identify, we analyze, and describe. And the subject matter that we identify, analyze, and describe is the mind, the mental processes, and behavior. So ultimately, those three constructs is what psychology is made up of. It's made up of the studying of the mind, mental processes, and behavior, and all the things that link to those constructs through scientific methods. So we spoke about, and one of your learning outcomes is what are the core components. So as we said there, the core components of psychology are the mind, mental processes, and behavior. So what is the mind? Okay. The mind is not the same thing as the brain, although it originates in the brain and it fosters human consciousness. It's more of a collection of faculties that are produced by the brain. It's a person's conscious understanding and thought processes. So it's not tangible. You can't touch it, unlike the brain. It doesn't have a shape and structure like the brain, but it is conscious processes and faculties of the brain. So your brain coordinates your movements, it coordinates your feelings and different functions of the body, and your mind is more a collection of faculties that are used then to produce mental processes. Okay, does everybody understand that? So what it does, it uses new and existing knowledge to actually generate those processes, but the mind is the element of our being that where the thought processes and things originate from. The second thing is mental processes. So your mental processes are the activities of the brain required to produce a sequence of actions, changes, and functions. So they have outcomes. All mental processes generally have outcomes mainly in the form of behavior. So your mental processes are things like your thoughts, your memory, your perception, your learning, and your reasoning. So those are what mental processes are. And any disruption of a mental process, no matter what causes it, is what leads to a disorder. And that's where your behavior is affected. So psychology focuses a lot on the mental processes that occur and disruption to mental processes that have an impact on our behavior. Sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the questions as well. I'll get to functional patterns shortly, Adrienne. So your behavior, the outcome of the mental processes, is any response that you might have as a living and human being. It's like an action or an outcome, and it's very dependent on our mental processes. Behavior, as much as we think it's sometimes involuntary, all our behavior is controlled by mental processes. And mental behavior can be it's a response to something, and that response can be a reaction to something or just a functional pattern. So a functional pattern is just a behavior that occurs, like, for example, sleep. Sleep is a functional pattern. It takes place pretty much all the time. It's regular. But a behavior can also be a reaction to something. If you have a hot stove on and you touch the plate with your fingertips and it burns you, you pull your hand away, and then a short while later you feel pain in your fingertips. That's a reaction. So some behaviors are functional behaviors. They have a function. Some behaviors are reactionary. So that's where the difference comes in. Both of them are outcomes of mental processes, because no matter what the behavior, there is a mental process that we go through. Exactly, Arjun, that's correct. So the textbook then moves into what it calls the tenets and propositions of psychology. So a tenet is a principle or a belief, and a proposition is something that we propose and it's offered for consideration or acceptance. So the two tenets, or the tenets and the proposition that the book details now around psychology, is firstly psychology as a discipline. It's the fluidity of development. So that means its development is not fixed. Its development is changing all of the time. It has a classic framework, yet it's contemporary. It keeps up to date with what's happening currently. So as much as it's got historical roots, and we've seen when we cover how far back in history psychology goes, it's got a past, and it's got a present, and it will also have a future as it continues to evolve. And so the discipline now, as it stands in its current state as psychology, wouldn't be what it is without what went before. All the work done by early theorists all adds up to where psychology sits now as a discipline. So in other words, psychology is undoubtedly historical, but thoroughly progressive. Research is ongoing and monumental, and it crosses multiple sort of areas in psychology, small areas, large areas. There is research generated all of the time in psychology. Therefore, fluidity and its ability to evolve is central to the evolution of psychology. Yes, Bridget, cognitive psychology does link to our mental processes, and we'll get to that shortly. The other thing that's important about psychology, and as you can imagine, as a discipline, it's got a diverse array of knowledge systems and influences. There are multiple things that have influenced psychology. Right back from many years ago, how the position we find ourselves in currently influences how we think about something. The position that happened in history a long time ago influences something. Yes, the PDF I've already loaded under more resources. So this PowerPoint that I'm going through you now, I've loaded, and it's there and it's available for you as to reference. And the Colab I will download when we're finished and upload it as a recording. So you'll have two sources for this as a reference. Please don't cite me in your assignments. I'm a tutor, and this is my set of slides. I'm not an academic source that can be cited in references, just by the way. So Our knowledge systems are very much influenced by how we make sense of information and our frame of reference. So somebody's frame of reference 200 years ago, 300 years ago, is very different to the frame of reference now. So all of those things have impact on how the knowledge system of psychology develops. There's cross-cultural influences, how things are perceived or behavior in one culture might be very different in another culture. So there's cross-cultural influences. There are environmental influences, society, community, politics. All of those at a given time have an impact on psychology and what is studied and what links to mental processes and behavior. Different eras, that's the history. Freud and early theorists were in a very different time to where our researchers and psychologists are now, has an impact on the knowledge systems. So there's been an evolution of different frameworks, there's been an evolution of different frames of reference, which you'll see as we work through the chapter. And within the frameworks are different models. So we might have a framework, and inside that are different models based on different assumptions and values. And the models that are used are referred to as paradigms. You will see the word paradigm quite often. And basically, a paradigm is something that's a widely accepted belief or principle. So does everybody get that? They're the core components, and that psychology as a whole is evolutionary with diverse array of knowledge systems. Right, so psychology goes back in time, and there's a section on your textbook that covers this, and I'm not going to cover it in great depth. I just think I need you to understand that it has evolved over many, many years. The textbook has got it comprehensively written out. There are those tables in the textbook that really plot for you where the different things came into play, what were the historical events at a given time that could influence what was done. So those tables are there for you to reference. I think our learning outcome was to briefly be able to show that psychology has evolved, and this history of psychology gives you that. So the conceptual development is there's many individuals who've achieved fame because of the impact they've made. And some of the names you might know already, people like Freud, people like Jung, people like Skinner. And in every case of those theorists, their contributions were influenced by the world around them and the historical context they found themselves in. The table will just consolidate for you. I think you'll see there are in the 20th century. Has anyone else lost audio? Hello?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Great. The focus will be on the more recent theorists. So for this point and the stuff that was early on, I think you just need to be aware and just have sort of almost like you've got here as a timeline of how it evolved. So the birth of psychology, really, if we say psychology is mental processes have been around for as long as Homo sapiens have been around. So people walked, they possibly were hunter-gatherers, and so therefore mental processes are as old as evolution of Homo sapiens themselves. So ancient physicians, so psychology is sort of came out of philosophy, but it also came out of those ancient physicians and things like in 9000 BCE. Now BCE stands for before the Common Era. I think it's the same way as saying we used to say BC and AC, but now BCE is before the Common Era. So that takes you back to ancient times, prehistoric times. And the first sort of sign of things to do with psychology was drilling of the skull to release demons. You had shamans who are sort of African traditional healers treating abnormal behavior. Health was an integrated construct of physical, social, and spiritual. So the shamans sort of looked at people, the physical well-being, the social, and the spiritual. Early modern histories of the earliest doctor was 2600 BCE. First mention of depression was in 1550 BCE. And in 500 BCE, there was a Chinese physician who introduced a 4-step diagnostic process, which was to observe, listen, ask, and check, okay, which still stands true today. Observe, listen, ask, and check, as well as the introduction of acupuncture. And I'm trying not to spend too much time because the rest of the module is quite deep. So the birth of psychology carries on. We spoke about the four steps in examination. There was the Sanskrit manual, Shashruta Shamhita, which also included some text on surgery. And this is all really from your book. There was Hippocrates in Greece, who started to introduce a scientific method. Plato described the brain as a seat of mental processes. Aristotle introduced the concept of a mind as a blank slate. And Freud, who we speak about a little bit later on, he was impressed by Plato's work. So you can see how Plato's work around philosophy started to now interest the later psychologists who came in. And Freud's conception of the id, ego, and superego are comparable to ancient Egyptian conceptions of the Baka and the Nun, respectively. So that taps into a little bit of that history. And there's also evidence of types of madness coming through. About halfway through the 1st century, there was an encyclopedia which details various medical conditions and briefly discusses mental illness. And the word insanity was introduced, which we still hold as a modern day term, but it was introduced many years ago. And within 50 years of the introduction of the Celsus Encyclopedia, there was a detailed description of depression in a later book and its relationship to biological processes in the human body. So nothing was cohesive about psychology, but people were starting to talk about mental processes, starting with medical, physiological, and then building more into the mind and some mental processes. There was also the influence of early Islam, which was around the Middle East and Arabia's awakening to Islam. Muslim sympathizers were dispersed, and basically Islam progressed through the Middle East, and actually the first psychiatric hospital was developed by the Muslims of Baghdad. And then there was a clinical psychiatry facility which focused on treating clinical treatment modalities. And then there was talk around mental health and the concept of psychotherapy. So it was starting to come in the early Islam movements. And apologies for my spelling of the word centuries in the next block. 11th to the 15th century, again with Persia. There was a visionary who was inspired by psychological constructs mentioned in the Quran. And what else happens there? It's all written there. And there was some descriptions of neuropsychiatric disorders. It's quite a bit of history. It's written in the book. And it's a case of you just having a timeline and just being aware and being able to say that it evolved from many years ago in various ways up until the current state. There were speculations about the mind. There was in 1605 that the term psychology was used. Rene Descartes introduced the theory of dualism, which is basically about the mind and the body being two separate things but working together. And so that was the first time there was starting to be a link between relationships between biological and mental processes. So that was his theory of dualism. And he had that saying, I think, therefore I am. So it was starting to introduce the concept of cognition, of mental processes. And there was also some introduction of the unconscious mind in 1701 by Leibniz. So it's all part of just evolution. No, you won't need to know specific dates. Your assignment, and I haven't seen the assignment yet, it might ask you for dates, but remember it's an open book assignment. So you don't need to know the dates. I think you just have a timeline, which is very well laid out in the book, that just helps you see how that evolution takes place across the world. It's not just in the Western world, it's across the world. And that's one of the things with psychology. It's not just limited to the Western world. So now moving into the 19th century. So remember, the 19th century is about 1800 to 1899. And one of our learning outcomes talks about the 20th century. So the 20th century is sort of from 1900 onwards. But 1800 to 1899 is basically where things started to happen, because that is where William James came in. And William James, he was one of the prominent theorists of the 1870s and started to work with experimental psychology. But Wilhelm Wundt, which is a name that you could need to remember, he's considered the father of modern psychology. And he established in 1879 the first formal laboratory in Germany, in Leipzig in Germany. So his classification is the first sort of person to have psychological experiments, and he basically looked at people's reaction times. It was very much a stimulus and response situation. If a light flashed, how long did it take somebody to respond? But it was done in a formal laboratory setting, and it was the first time where the discipline of science as empirical came to the fore. So he also contributed to writing the first journal. In theory, developed what you could say is the science of psychology, and he focused on attention, memory, sensory process, and reaction time. So that's where psychology as a scientific discipline now started to stamp its mark. It is too premature to ask if the exam will be online or at campus, but as soon as a decision is made, you will be communicated with, Margaret. So that's Wilhelm Wundt. So now this is where we start to go a little bit deeper, and we start to get a little bit more relevant in terms of 20th century psychologists. So structuralism and functionalism are basically two schools of thought. That the minute we started to measure science with Wilhelm Wundt, we started to get different people saying you could look at psychology in different ways. The way of the structuralists, or structuralism. Structuralism is basically, it's an approach in which the mind is broken down to the smallest little elements of mental experience. So Edward Titchner was the first proponent of structuralism, and he studied under Wilhelm Wundt. And what his objective was to break everything down into its smallest possible elements. So like physics or like chemistry, you have a whole, but the whole needs to be broken down into its small, tiny little compartments, like sensations, feelings, and images. So everything is built from those basic building blocks, like building blocks up. And that's what structuralist does. It was very experimental, and it focuses on different brain elements and their capacities. So it analyzed the experience, for example, of auditory tones, of visual response to stimuli, optical illusions, all in a scientific way under controlled conditions. And that was the first school of thought. And then there were people who said, no, that's not right. Its behavior and mental processes cannot be broken down into these basic elements. That now we need to look at a more functionalist. So it's about function. So it was introduced as a counter argument to structuralism. And it focuses on the adaptations of the human mind, so to different environments. So an approach that saw behavior as purposefully contributing towards survival. So not broken down into little pieces at all. It sees behavior as a whole and behavior important towards survival. So the proponents of functionalism, the first one was William James. And the study of the mind, as I say in that little block or little quote at the beginning, the study of the mind includes the study of the mind in the body. Okay, it's a whole thing. And so what William James was interested in, and the functionalists, is investigated the function and purpose of consciousness as a whole rather than all the little elements of consciousness. So drawing from Darwin's theory of evolution, he very much focused on which talks about characteristics are heritable and provide for survival or reproductive advantage. So that's where he drew it from, that everything that happens is based around the need to survive, the need to reproduce, and it's one thing. And consciousness consists of a continuous flow of thoughts rather than being static as suggested by structuralists. So there was a stream of consciousness. We're always thinking, there's awareness, there's conscious awareness, and this is a continuous flow of thoughts rather than lots and lots and lots of little building blocks. So consciousness is one big thing that moves consistently. And he moved away from what was done in a lab, so that very scientific breakdown experiment on reaction times, to focus more on how people behave and adapt in the real world. So it was focused very much on a wider behavior based on what people were experiencing in the real world. So behavior is purposeful. That was their big thing, and it has a reason. We act for a reason. The value we place on our behavior depends on the consequences. So if the consequence is good, would we repeat the behavior? Yes, we would. If the consequence was bad, would we repeat the behavior? Probably not. So behavior has a purpose, it has a reason. And William James as a whole, he left his imprint on the fields. In psychology, we have behaviorism and we have applied psychology. So he sat there right at the beginning of that process, and the things that he thought and that he wrote about are foundational to a lot of the perspectives that we currently are involved with. So those were sort of the early schools of thought, and you can see debate. It was very open. People had different areas that they studied, how they studied them, why they studied them, but ultimately all of them impact on the discipline of psychology. So now we move into that learning outcome that says about the 20th century. And I think this is your ICE task, about the influence of psychologists in the 20th century. So the 20th century really is from 1900 to 1999. So from that year. So the first one of these, and remember, we're not going into depth on these psychologists. We will get to them in more detail in later chapters. The first one that you've probably all heard is Freud. And Freud was in the early 1900s. And he developed a process called psychoanalysis. And that was a way that he used to treat people with psychological problems. And it is the talking cure, yes. But what he did was he asked people to look inward. A lot of psychology is introspective. It's looking inwards, and that's what he asked to do. But what he did was he believed that everything that happened to us in our past was impacting on us in a subconscious level, in our unconscious. And so what he tried to do is he tried to get people to dig down into their unconscious, to try to reveal things that were influencing their behavior. So a lot of it was about things that had been repressed that you couldn't remember, always feeling that something traumatic had happened and you'd repressed it and tried to get it out. And so that's where he tried to go, and he looked at things like dream analysis. He believes that a lot of those unconscious things come out in dreams. Things like slips of the tongue, you've all heard of Freudian slips, that shows unconscious thoughts and desires, and that people aren't really masters of their own minds, that everything that happens belongs in their unconscious and we don't have any control over it. But like I think his first study was on hysteria, and somebody who was suffering from hysteria, and using things like hypnosis would try and put them under and try and find out what unconscious things are causing their problems. Had a big emphasis on sex and control of repressed sexual urges. Yes, the PDF you see on the screen will be able to review on your own. Yes, it's all there for you. It's there already, so don't worry. And then, yes, correct, Bridget, focused on problematic parts of the human personality. But again, like anything, people go in and out of favor. People sort of all move in one direction, and then some people will move in other directions. So there are arguments against psychoanalysis because it failed to account for anything spiritual, cultural, and evolutionary, which is true. It was rooted in sort of one area of people's unconscious. So Carl Jung, who was working with Freud, sort of parted ways with Freud, still dealing a little bit with the unconscious, but he had what was called a collective unconscious around shared human experiences that we all shared, which were influenced by our culture and spiritual beliefs. So whereas Freud really didn't have time for what had influences on us outside our unconscious, Jung started now to look at the influences of culture and spiritual beliefs. And he developed something called an archetype, which is a mental image of something. And I think we do cover archetypes in later modules. But for example, if you say the word dog, I say to you the word dog, you pick up a mental image of a dog. Now, when I say dog, I picture an Alsatian. If I say dog to you, you might picture a terrier or something. So an archetype is a mental image of something, and that's what he saw in our unconscious, was all of these different mental images of various things. But they do have impact. They are impacted by culture and environment and things like that, not purely based on what someone has experienced. So after Freud and Jung, slightly after that, 1913 to about 1920, saw the rise of behaviorism. And behaviorism is still very relevant today. It's probably one of the most enduring perspectives in psychology. And it's very relevant, and it's something that when we study elements of behaviorism, we can really apply them in our everyday lives, and we can see elements in our everyday lives. And it's a really interesting section of study. So basically, it was the primary paradigm. So from 1920 to 1950, everybody was about behaviors. Okay, Isabella, just remind me at the end, I'll discuss the ICE tasks again. So psychology should be seen as a science, and theories need to be supported by empirical data obtained through careful and controlled measurement and observation of behavior. So therefore, behaviorism as a science is primarily concerned with what can be observed in behavior, as opposed to what's internal, like emotions. So therefore, they'll look at a behavior itself, that's the outcome of the mental processes, and to see if it can be objectively and scientifically measured. So it's still rooted in science, behaviorism as an empirical science. So behavior, that I'm sort of on the left-hand side of the page here now, is about a stimulus and a response. So we have a stimulus to something. Something happens to us as an observable event in an environment, and we have a response. The behavior is the response to that stimulus. Behavior generally doesn't happen unless there's a stimulus. So generally, and if somebody has a behavioral problem, you have to try and see what the stimulus is. What is the event that's causing that behavior to take place? So it's a stimulus and response, and we will cover this in more detail. But behaviorists primarily used animals because in those days you couldn't really use humans for scientific experiments. So much of the work around behaviorism and the early research that they did was using animals. So for example, Ivan Pavlov was a behaviorist. He was a theorist who worked in the behavioral space, and he worked with conditioned reflexes. I don't know if you've heard of Pavlov's dog. It is basically where he conditions a dog to salivate. So if you give a dog a bone or show the dog a bone, it will salivate. If you ring a bell, the dog doesn't salivate. If you link the bell and the bone together, the dog will salivate. And then if you take away the bone and just ring the bell, the dog will salivate because it's linked the bell to the bone. So that's a behavior. It's a conditioned behavior. And you can see now how we today still experience conditioned behaviors. We're conditioned to do certain things. So it's still very much relevant and very much current. John B. Watson was another significant behaviorist, and he was really the founder of behaviorism. And scientific and observable. Therefore, consciousness and mental processes are not scientific, therefore they don't fit into the discipline. He was very much based around the fact that behavior had to be observed. Yes, exactly. Dolphins, exactly. Attempt to get to the core root of why people think and act as they do. Yes, exactly. The core root as to why behavior happens. It does look at that. There is the debate around nature and nurture. Are things born? Are they genetic, or are we made? Nature is behavior is determined by genetic inheritance, and nurture is behavior is determined by something in our environment and what we experience. So that we do cover that, I think, in the third chapter. You'll see reference to that. So it could be, for example, that people do twin studies, and if you have two twins separated at birth and they're raised in completely different environments, do they end up the same or do they end up different? Are they the same because of nature and a genetic inheritance, or is the environment and the experience, does that have an impact on how people behave? So obviously, being a behaviorist, he was a full believer in nurture. And his writing very much focused on environmental factors. And he's well known for his little Albert experiment, in which he demonstrated that a child could be conditioned to fear a previously neutral stimulus. So he had a rat. I think he had a little child called Little Albert, and Little Albert ran around with a little rat, a very nice fluffy little white rat, and then someone banged a big piece of metal, which gave Albert a fright. And what happened is that Albert, who never feared the rat, now started to fear the rat because the rat was being linked to that loud and frightening noise for the child. So it is around about conditioning. Again, behavior can be conditioned. And he left the profession, he ended up in advertising. And you can see advertising and behaviorism are very closely linked, because when you see an advert, what does it do? It appeals to our behavior. With whatever it is. It might be somebody driving a nice car and you want to be driving the nice car, so you go and buy the car, and advertising prompts behavior. So his discipline led him into advertising, where he did exceptionally well. And Skinner, again, another behaviorist. So those are three behaviorists. Skinner looked at operant conditioning, and again, we do cover that later. And operant conditioning is basically, if the response is positive, the behavior will be repeated. If the response is sort of neutral, the behavior will be repeated. But if it's got a negative outcome, you don't repeat the behavior. So it's a bit like a reward and punishment system, really. Children get rewarded for good behavior and punished for bad behavior. And he used Skinner boxes, which is where he put rats into little boxes, and they had to push a lever to get pellets of food. And sometimes they pushed the lever and they got an electric shock. Therefore, they stopped putting the lever with the shock, but pushed the lever for the food. So you're conditioned to repeat behaviors. And that free will is an illusion. That was his big thing, was that free will is an illusion, but we're controlled by our environment. So we're never really free of what is happening around us. So three behaviorists, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner, fundamental in this piece of psychology and this perspective of psychology. And they had a time period between about 1913 and 1920 or 1950 that they were very influential. Humanism, another perspective, again developed just slightly after behaviorism in the 1950s. And those two theorists who were predominant in humanism was Maslow and Carl Rogers. So humanism, exactly that. It focuses on the unique qualities of being human. So now it's actually focusing in on the person and the personal perspective and what makes us unique as individuals. That everybody basically is good, and everybody has the potential for growth. And that is what humanism strives for. It strives for making sure that people have potential and room for growth. And people are actually driven not by evolutionary needs of reproduction or survival. They're driven by a need to achieve their full potential. They're driven by a need to reach a point of self-actualization, to be the best that they can be. And when that is interfered with, when they can't meet that need of self-actualizing, they can suffer mental disturbances. So that's really what humanism means, focused very much on the individual, and about their ability to achieve. It's very client-centered in terms of practice today. A lot of those client-centered principles are still very relevant. As a psychologist, having an emphasis on listening to what people say, not watching their behavior or testing their reaction time. It's on listening, and around the fact that we don't have bad societies, just bad people. They believe in inherent good of everything. So Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you might have seen in the past, but basically to get to a point of self-actualization, we have to have our physiological needs met. We can't become the best that we can be if we're hungry, if we're thirsty, if we have no clothes. So we have to meet that need. Once we've met that need, we have to be safe. We then have to have love and belonging, and we also then have to have self-esteem. And only then can we get to a point of self-actualization. So not many people reach that true point of self-actualization because, you know, there might be issues in the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy that can't be met. And again, we cover this in more detail, but it's just showing you the diversity and the evolution of psychology as a discipline. And you can see now how this field is so big and so broad. And Carl Rogers was another influential theorist in humanism, and he looked very much around self-image, how we feel about ourselves, and an ideal self, and basically the overlap. And if they're not congruent with each other, it can cause disorders. So it's also very much around self, how we see ourselves, how others see us, and how we want to see ourselves in the future. Self-actualization is the pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy. Kirsten, it's the top level. And the numbers you get there, as I said, are not everybody gets to that pure level of self-actualization. So that's humanism. Okay, the next perspective is a more, although it's an old perspective, it's more recent in terms of how people think about it. It's evolution. And so evolution, we all know what evolution is. It's around how we've adapted to survive over the years since we've been on this earth, and how evolution and that need to survive and the need to reproduce, that need has always remained with us. And as a result, it's shaped how we think and how we behave. So evolutionary psychology is an actual branch of psychology that still looks at those potential issues of reproduction and survival. So that tells us behavioral patterns have evolved to solve adaptive problems. Thanks, Isabella. Thanks for joining us. It'll be up on as a video. So that's about natural selection, survival of the species. So behavior, like anatomical characteristics, also evolves as a product of evolution. And behavior enhances the ability to produce genes onto the next generation. That's all it is. We behave in a way that we can carry on and evolve to the next generation. So you can see the picture on the left. It's about how a giraffe, for example, has grown a long neck to be able to eat from the tops of trees. It's evolution. And behavior has evolved in the same way that helps support evolutionary principles. So evolutionary psychology proposes to us that the human brain comprises many functional mechanisms called psychological adaptations or evolved cognitive mechanisms designed by the process of natural selection. So things like language acquisition are examples of evolution. We avoid incest. It's an avoidance mechanism that's part of evolution. We can detect cheaters and liars and thieves. Sex mating preferences, foraging mechanisms are all examples of behavior that now impact, or evolution that impacts on our behavior. So evolutionary psychology is really that same pattern. And the final one, I think, is cognitive psychology, which somebody spoke about. Cognitive psychology is about behavior, can't be fully understood without understanding how people acquire, store, and process information. So that's our thinking process. Cognition is about thinking, it's about thought. Cognitive psychology is still very relevant, and sometimes cognitive and behavioral are linked together. So Cognitive psychology really focuses on our intelligence. It focuses on our perception, what attention we pay to things. It focuses on our memory. It focuses on thinking and problem solving, and it focuses on language. So it's all of those processes that make up our thoughts, our memory, our attention, all form part of cognitive psychology. Important, well, not really important theorist, but relevant theorist here is Piaget. And we see that when we study child development. He has a theory of how thinking develops, and he has stages of cognitive development which start when the baby's small and moves up to about the age of 12, and it's how those cognitive processes are developed. Chomsky is another one around language acquisition. Language, we have a natural ability to learn languages. There's a theory of universal grammar. Language is innate. So all of those are kind of cognitive processes that form part of cognitive psychology and the cognitive perspective. And the final one is the biological perspective. And we see that in the next chapter. We move on to the brain and the nervous system. But basically, it's saying that human behavior needs to be understood from a biological perspective, and that in our body we have physiological processes, and those physiological processes can impact on behavior. So it's looking at the brain, it's looking at regions of the brain, it's looking at our nervous system. So if you think of depression, for example, how do we treat depression? Depression is treated by a chemical or a medicine that we take that readjusts some of our neurotransmitters in our brain. So therefore, depression has a biological basis. Bipolar disorder, for example, has a biological basis. So a lot of disorders we see in psychology have a biological basis. Leila, there's not much in the textbook. Again, it depends on the assignment question. But yes, it is always more useful to do research, especially on these areas of the different perspectives, because they will come in time and time again as we move through the different learning units and start to pull things together. So the better understanding you have of some of these processes, the easier it will make it for you. It's more foundational at this point. So yeah, if you've got time, it's a good idea to do some additional research. Use the theorists that I've named as proponents, but you can also just generally research the perspective itself. So that's what the biological perspective means. It's neuroscience. It's studying the brain, lesions in the brain, how it impacts on behavior. Damage to a certain part of the brain can impact on behavior. So biological perspective is important, and that's quite a part of our next 2 learning units, and you'll see that. So overall, we've covered those different perspectives, and what the last learning outcome, or the second to last, is to know those different perspectives. So there they are, mapped out in a table. This table is in your textbook, and I've taken it from there. So the different perspectives, it's the behavioral one, what we spoke about, the psychoanalytic perspective, which was Freud and Jung. We spoke about the humanistic perspective, which is Rogers and Maslow. The cognitive perspective, we spoke about the biological perspective, and the evolutionary. So within psychology as a discipline, there are different perspectives on psychology. And if you become a practicing psychologist or a researcher or in any field of psychology, you might work in one of those perspectives. You might become specialized in cognitive psychology, or it could be cognitive and behavioral. So it is, each one is a different way of looking at psychology. So there's the principal contributors there, and I think I've highlighted in this presentation some of the more important ones, and they're mainly the ones in the book who there's detail on. So those should be the focus. What the different subject matter of those perspectives are. So behavior is the effect of the environment, psychoanalytic is the unconscious, humanistic is the unique aspects that make us human, cognitive is our thoughts and mental processes, behavior is the biological is the physiological basis, and the evolutionary. So that's a table then that summarizes those 6 different perspectives, and it's one of your learning outcomes is to understand those different perspectives. But again, remember, this is still just the tip of the iceberg, so don't get too panicky about too much depth. Just know that they exist, who their main contributors were, if those contributors had significant contributions, and what their basic premise is, should be enough to help you understand and get to grips with that. So when it comes to a profession of psychology, and you'll see that, well, why we see psychology as such a big discipline, there's those different areas of specialization. So if you study psychology and you see it through to your end of your 3-year degree, your honors, your masters, you might not all want to become clinical psychologists. There are neuropsychologists who study the brain. There are counseling psychologists who work around possibly cognitive and cognitive therapies for counseling people. There's educational psychologists. So when we look at learning and learning behaviors, that could be around educational psychologists. Psychologists who are involved in research. Research is ongoing. All universities employ researchers. So there's a research element. You could become an industrial psychologist who work in organizations to look at organizational culture and how employees work together. And then once you fall below that, the subcategories. So if you don't quite make it to be a registered psychologist, there are registrations for things like registered counselors, registered psychometrists. Those are people who administer psychometric testing, and mental health. And whatever happens in psychology, ultimately, if you practice, you have to be registered with the Health Professions Council. So again, that tells us that it's scientific, it's ethical. There's a registration process. So to get to a point of professional registration, and this was something I took off the internet from a website called Cognition & Co., that if you are interested in studying psychology to become a clinical psychologist, it gives you an idea of the route. So I think at the moment we're all doing 3-year BA degrees, hopefully majoring in psychology, that you'd follow that with an honors degree. You would follow that with a master's degree in clinical psychology. You'd have to do some internships and practicing, and then you register. So it's a big profession. If it doesn't say in the question, do additional research, can we just use the textbook? If it doesn't say do additional research, yes, you can use the textbook, but you have to be able to interpret the textbook. And I would still always suggest that you do additional research. It doesn't hurt. It really doesn't. Sports psychology is awesome. I think that's a growing profession, and I think UKZN offers sports psychology as a subject. I'm not sure. And again, where are psychologists employed? So if you actually do get that far to getting right to the end, a clinical psychologist, 33% are in private practice, hospitals and clinics, in schools. So there's a wide employment. So you can see psychology is an enormous discipline. It's like being a doctor with all the specializations and being a doctor in medicine. Psychology has exactly the same. So the last quick slide, I think, is the last bit about psychology in Africa. And this is where the book is interesting based on last year, because it does introduce it. And remember that what we've seen so far about the history of psychology is it's mainly seen as a Western-based discipline. All of the research that's done back all of those years ago, Freud, all of those theorists were sort of a Western typical demographic. They were white, they were male, they were middle-aged, they were from high income brackets. And if we remember that our environment, the history, the era we live in, our frame of reference, all influence how we think about something, all of that early research is very much influenced by the type of people who conducted it. So sort of where does that leave us in Africa and South Africa? And you know, the discipline of psychology in South Africa has been around for many years, around 1910. But again, its evolution in South Africa has been very disjointed. It obviously had colonial influences. It obviously was practiced along the very same lines as the Western way of practicing it. So there's never really been, until more recent times, really understanding the cultural influences, the social, the environmental, the spiritual influences that have an impact on sort of African or Afrocentric psychology. So it's quite a more recent area of study, and it's really worth investigating, especially if you're a practicing psychologist in South Africa, to be aware of the context in which we're working. So the Western psychologists really had those cultural variables of the Western world, but as the world is growing and we're becoming a global village, and ethnicities are moving around the globe, psychology has to become more multicultural. It can't really be based on where that person sits at that given time, because they sit in a society that's multicultural. So it's really important to start to develop a more multicultural perspective. So there's an Afrocentric psychology, which really, its theories of models, it can be described as models aimed at people who have African descent. So it's like in America, you have sort of the African community in America, and there would be a model of people who are from African descent. So it's Afrocentric. It can be practiced anywhere in the world, and it's really aimed at people who are from African descent. And then you get the true African psychology. Um, so again, it's where in the past it was Eurocentric. So now it seems to say, what is an African person? What influences an African person? It's influenced very much by the realities of our cultures and our different cultures. And so African psychology really now is looking at the biological, the psycho component, the socio component, the cultural component, and the spiritual perspective to see what makes a true African psychological perspective. So we know, for example, that within an African culture, often there's a very big spiritual explanation for a behavior that takes place. And it's happening, the spirits could be the ancestors, it's happening outside the perimeter of what's natural for us. So it's to be aware that psychology in South Africa has been there for many years, but it has followed a trajectory similar to that as evolution of psychology across the globe. But now it does need to be more focused on the African person, okay, whichever culture they come from, but taking in all of those different elements. So that, guys, is that, and that we're studying psychology, not telepathy. And psychology, you can see it's big. Child psychology, child psychologists, it's awesome. Child psychologists is a very big subject area, again, with many theorists. And child psychology looks at mental processes, the evolution of mental processes, development, physical development in children, mental development, social development. There's all of those aspects. And in childhood, that's where the primary part of learning is. So child psychology is a very big section, and it's very interesting. And I hope you'll enjoy it. But again, like medicine, you go across all the different disciplines, and then you decide if you want to specialize. So, experience all of the areas of psychology, and you might change your mind and find a different area that you want to specialize. But good, I'm glad you've got some direction. A PSYC degree is a specialized degree that's offered specifically for psychology, and it's generally that 4-year degree complete, whereas the sort of BA Psych is going to be 3 years and a 4th year honors. So I think they're both generally 4 years, but in the 4-year degree, you're more specialized in psychology. So the ICE activities in your activities on the learning unit, it's got activity 1.2.1. If before the word activity, it's got the word ICE in capital letters, they will build, they are the ICE activities. You need to submit them. Okay, you can do the other activities with the greatest of pleasure. In fact, you should do them, but the only ones I will mark and that you need to submit are the ICE activities. So that is where the ICE activities are. The assignments is a PDF document that's got an assignment written on it. It's got due date and it's got questions, and that will be loaded for you to actually download as an assignment. So the ICE activities are those little activities in the learning unit that you have to do, the 4 of them. There's 4 of them labeled ICE tasks, and you have to submit all 4. They're not big. Part of the ICE tasks, and just a heads up as well, is they're often quite different. They might ask you to contribute to a discussion. Remember that when we're studying in a distance space, we still have to collaborate. And so there could be a question, post a blog, post a discussion, comment on someone else's discussion. So all the time in those ICE activities, there is the element that you might have to collaborate. So each ICE activity is quite different, and it will ask you to do different things that you might not be used to, but it's very straightforward. They're money for jam little activities, and just say that this is just cementing what you've learned in that learning unit. I haven't seen the assignment yet, so I can't ask, but I will find out where the assignment is for you. It is possible. Is it possible for assignment to change? No, once it's loaded, it can't change. The ICE task you do through the VC Learning platform. When you click on the ICE task, it will take you to the tool. So the tool might be a discussion forum, it might be a blog, it might be somewhere where you load up a file. You might have had to do a Word document or a mind map or something, and you upload it, but they get submitted through the platform. Everything gets submitted through the platform. You don't email me any assignments. All your assignments have to be uploaded on the platform. So you don't email me anything. The only thing you email me is a question. Okay, you don't email me assignments. ICE tasks, we said at the beginning, ICE tasks will be due in theory by the end of May, when your thanks Bridget, when your CAS mark is compiled. You have to have a CAS mark in order to be able to take the exam. I think your CAS mark has to be 40%. And so I will say to you guys, your ICE tasks are all due by a certain date. I'm not doing it one by one by one by one, but I would suggest you submit them one by one by one. So I have time to mark them and give you feedback. The important thing for me is giving you feedback. And if you submit everything late or last minute, I can't give you the feedback that I might have to make your experience better and help you with your assignment. So I do ask that you submit the ICE task. As you do the learning unit, do your activities, submit your ICE task. Otherwise, you end up with too much on your plate, and I end up with too much to mark all in one go, and I just can't give you guys feedback. So those are the ICE tasks. Some lecturers you might hear, oh, we've got a deadline for our ICE tasks. You know, next week I just have one deadline, and I will tell you when it is towards the end of May. But just be prepared for that, is all I can say. So that is the end of the first collab session. I know it seems like a lot and I throw stuff at you, but you know, I aim just to cover those important points to help maybe picture something that you're struggling to understand. I don't go into too much depth in areas where I think it's not necessary. It's on the textbook. The recording will be available and the slides are already available. The next learning unit is on the brain, and that's a very big learning unit. It's probably the biggest one. And again, there's a lot of text there. So try to pre-read, guys, before we do this, because otherwise you can get lost. I've got students who are very new and older students. If you guys are struggling with anything, please pop me a message. I'm here permanently for you. That's my job. So enjoy. I hope you had a good evening, and I hope these times are fruitful for you. And please, any questions, just ask. I'm going to stop the recording now, and it will be uploaded tomorrow. It just takes a little while to download. So I'll say